The second place rule. Once before, the Supreme Court made this pronouncement. The wreath of victory cannot be transferred from an ineligible candidate to any other candidate when the sole question is the eligibility of the one receiving a plurality of the legally cast ballots. This means that if the first placer is disqualified, regardless of reason, regardless of ground, the second placer cannot be proclaimed the winner on the ground that he or she is simply not the choice of the Filipino people. But recently, we make a distinction. It now depends on the ground or reason by which the first placer was disqualified. For example, if the candidate for mayor, at the time of the filing of the certificate of candidacy, had all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications, he is considered to be a valid candidate to begin with. However, after filing the certificate of candidacy, along the way, he did something to offend election laws. For example, he was found guilty of vote buying, or found guilty of overspending, or found guilty to have committed acts of terrorism, among others, he is going to be disqualified. But it does not change the fact that in the first instance, he was a valid candidate to begin with. If that happens, he was disqualified because he committed any of these disqualifying acts, the second placer cannot be proclaimed the winner because there was a valid candidate to begin with. And the second placer is simply not the choice of the Filipino people. But the rule is different if the candidate had a problem insofar his qualifications are concerned. For example, if the candidate for mayor suffered from an existing disqualification or lacked one of the minimum qualifications for public office, his candidacy is going to be considered void from the very beginning. There was no valid candidate to begin with. What is the legal basis? If this candidate for mayor, for example, falls under any of the enumerated persons who are disqualified to run for public office, it could either be under Section 12, 65, or 78 of the Omnibus Election Code. Under Section 12 of the Omnibus Election Code, the following cannot run for public office or are disqualified to run for public office: the insane or incompetent, provided they are declared as such by competent authority; those who are found guilty with finality of the crime of subversion, insurrection, or rebellion; and those who are found guilty with finality of a crime that carries with it a penalty of more than 18 months imprisonment; and those who are found guilty with finality of a crime involving moral turpitude, they are disqualified to run for public office under Section 12. This means that if you fall under any of these enumerated persons, you cannot be considered a valid candidate to begin with. What about Section 65? It actually cross-references to Sections 39 and 40 of the Local Government Code that enumerates the following as disqualified to run for public office. If the person is convicted with finality of a crime involving moral turpitude, if a person is convicted with finality of a crime that carries with it a penalty of 1 year imprisonment, those removed from office, and those found to have violated oath of allegiance, the dual citizens, and the fugitives from justice, which do not only include those who flee to avoid service of sentence after conviction, but also those who flee to avoid prosecution after cases or criminal cases have been filed against them, and also the permanent residents abroad. Because if you're a permanent resident elsewhere other than the Philippines, it negates your residence in the country, which is one of the minimum qualifications to run for public office. And again, the insane or feeble-minded, provided they're declared as such by competent authority. So aside from Section 12, if you fall under the disqualified persons under Section 65 of the Omnibus Election Code, you cannot be considered a valid candidate to begin with. What about Section 78? It actually relates to Section 74 of the Omnibus Election Code. This deals with material misrepresentation or falsity committed by the candidate in his or her certificate of candidacy. Misrepresentation becomes material if it pertains to the minimum qualifications for public office, like, for example, citizenship, age, residence, registration as a voter, and literacy or the ability to read and write. So, for example, the candidate for mayor stated in his or her certificate of candidacy that he is a natural born Filipino when in fact he is not, and in fact he's a dual citizen. That becomes material misrepresentation that can warrant the cancellation of his or her certificate of candidacy. And if that happens, he is not to be considered a valid candidate to begin with. And so, for example, the candidate for mayor who is disqualified under any of those provisions, Section 12, 65, or 78 of the Omnibus Election Code, regardless of the number of votes he obtained in the elections. For example, he was the first placer with 100,000 votes. All those 100,000 votes are going to be strayed because he or she is not a valid candidate to begin with. So what if the second placer obtained nearly, let's say, 50,000 votes, or half the number of votes obtained by the first placer? No problem, because that second placer, because there was no valid candidate to begin with in the person of the first placer, that second placer is actually considered the first placer among the qualified candidates. Because remember, those votes, regardless of the number obtained by the first placer, who is not a candidate to begin with, these were strayed. And so the second placer is actually the first placer among the qualified candidates. If that happens, the second placer is proclaimed the winner. And in fact, we said that second placer is actually the first placer. However, what happens if there was a valid candidate to begin with, all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications, but he did something to offend election laws? The second placer cannot be proclaimed the winner because there was a valid candidate to begin with. What happens is succession applies. So if it was the mayor, the governor, or the president who was disqualified because he's not a valid candidate to begin with, the vice mayor, the vice governor, or the vice president assumes office as mayor, governor, or president by virtue of succession. But that is insofar as a single slot position is concerned, like mayor, governor, district rep, or president. What if it involves a multi-slot position, like senators, there are 12, board members, there are 2 per district, councilors, there could be 8, 10, or 12. If that happens, the position of the first placer is going to be vacated, and it is going to be filled out later on by virtue of appointment. So now the best way to remember or to understand this concept is this. You must be able to discern what exactly is the ground why the first placer was disqualified. If there was no candidate to begin with because the first placer lacked one of the minimum qualifications to public office or otherwise suffered from existing disqualification, the second placer is proclaimed winner because there was no valid candidate to begin with in the person of the first placer. And again, the second placer is actually the first placer among the qualified candidates. However, if the first placer was a valid candidate to begin with, meaning he had all the qualifications and none of the disqualifications at the time he filed his certificate of candidacy, but however, along the way he did something to offend election laws that disqualified him, the second placer cannot be proclaimed the winner because he or she is not the choice of the Philippine people. Before you go, please read the disclaimer. And as my parting shot, I always say, an informed electorate is essential or indispensable in a democracy. Thank you.